Well, it's a great privilege to start our weekend by introducing Dr. Neil Messer, who read biochemistry at Bristol University and did his PhD at the Medical Research Council Laboratory of Molecular Biology here in Cambridge. And then he trained for ordination in the United Reformed Church in this very college. And he served as a minister in the URC. They did a master's degree in ethics, Christian ethics, and he's taught ethics at Mansfield College, Oxford, and in Birmingham. And in 2001 he became senior lecturer in Christian ethics and convener of the Research Institute for Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Wales, Lampeter, which is where he is now. His research interests are in Christian ethics, with a particular focus on ethical issues in medicine, biology and biotechnology. He's written several books, which we have on the bookstall, also chapters in books edited by Celia Dean Drummond, which are also on the bookstall. So do browse and buy if you would like to. He's advised the Church in Wales and the United Reformed Church on bioethical issues, and recently participated in a Nuffield Council consultation with faith groups on the ethics of neonatal care. So I think there's nobody better qualified, I think, than to start us off for this weekend. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your welcome and introduction. Thank you for the chance to be here. It's very good to be able to be the kind of warm-up act for this weekend. It looks like a very exciting, interesting programme, certainly. The brief that I've been given for this lecture, as I understand it, is to give an introduction to Christian ethics, to Christian moral reasoning, and to show how it might address the ethical issues that are raised by new developments in science, technology and medicine. And I want to do that by, first of all, taking a quick look at one example of a current British debate about an issue that is proving highly controversial. Having done that, I want to dig a little below the surface of that debate. I want to suggest that it has some problematic features that are characteristic of public ethical debates in societies like modern Britain. And I'll argue that because of these problematic features, Christians engaging with such debates should not be content to accept the ways in which those debates are usually framed. Rather, they should be willing to reframe them, to change the questions, if you like. And I'll suggest one way in which a particular strand of Christian theological tradition might approach the ethical issues raised by science and technology. And I'll make a few remarks about how such a distinctively Christian voice might engage with other voices in public debate. Now, in the later parts of the lecture particularly, I'll be working quite deliberately, as I've already suggested, from within a particular Christian tradition. And for reasons that I hope will become clearer as I go through the lecture, I think that moral reasoning always has its roots in some tradition or some combination of traditions, whether its practitioners realise that or not. I think it's at its most effective when its practitioners are clear about the traditions that have given rise to their moral reasoning and deliberation. So it seems to me that the most helpful way that I can start a conversation about ethical issues in this area is to give as clear an account as I can of the tradition within which I'm working and its moral implications. And my hope is that this will encourage those of you who might belong to different religious or moral or intellectual traditions to do the same. And that way we can start a genuine and fruitful conversation. So I begin then with an example of a current public debate. In 2007, the British government introduced a bill to update existing legislation on fertility treatment, embryo research and some related areas. And one of its new provisions allowed for the creation of interspecies embryos for research purposes, under licence and subject to various restrictions. Now, it's worth saying in passing that the revised version of the bill that's currently before Parliament uses the term human admixed embryos. The older version used the term interspecies embryos. A lot of the discussion I'll be referring to uses that term, interspecies embryos, and in general that's the term I'll be using as well. What they meant by this included animal cells into which human nuclei have been transferred, embryos in which human and animal gametes are combined, transgenic human embryos that contain animal DNA sequences, and chimeras made by introducing animal cells into human embryos. These are the kinds of constructs that the legislation had in mind. And not surprisingly, this provision in the draft bill provoked a great deal of controversy and argument. And among other things, that means that the work of the Parliamentary Select Committee that was set up to examine that draft bill, and the evidence that committee received, provide a very useful sample of the kinds of arguments that get deployed in public debates about the ethics of science and technology in a context like modern Britain. Well, as you might expect, much of the most enthusiastic support for research on interspecies embryos came from the biotech industry, the biomedical research community in general, and patient groups. And it has to be said, some of those who stated their support to the Select Committee and in public debates didn't offer any reasons why they thought this kind of research should be permitted, or at most, all they offered were pragmatic or procedural reasons. But some did offer moral arguments for permitting this kind of research. And of those who did, the great majority, as you might expect, appealed in one way or another to the benefits, particularly the healthcare benefits, which they said this research promises. And they tended to argue that even areas that don't currently attract a lot of scientific or medical interest could turn out to be important in the future. So they said, the legislation should not only permit the kinds of constructs that we want to use now in our research, it also needs to be permissive enough to allow scientists to respond quickly to new developments. Otherwise, they said, we risk holding back scientific and medical progress in the future in ways that we might find it hard to foresee now. In other words, the argument that the British Parliament should be permissive about interspecies embryo research was largely based on claims about the likely consequences of that decision. To legislate in favour of this research, the argument goes, would open the way to great benefits in terms of the relief of suffering, treatments for serious and life-threatening diseases, and so on. On the other hand, legislation that severely restricted this kind of research would deny us those benefits. The consequences of permissive legislation would be better overall than the consequences of restrictive legislation. Now, to the extent that arguments in support of this kind of research concentrated on consequences, they could have done that for one of two reasons. Those who were arguing in this way might have been making the assumption that consequences, the consequences of our actions and decisions, are the ultimate measure of the rightness or wrongness of those actions and decisions. Other things like moral rules and principles might serve as useful guidelines, but those factors can always be set aside if considerations about consequences demand it. Those factors can always be trumped by a calculation of the consequences. Alternatively, people who are arguing in this kind of way might have been quite ready to acknowledge that there could be other factors that have a bearing on moral decision making, but that as it happens on this question, the consequences are the only things we need to consider. Anyone who made the first of those assumptions, the stronger claim that consequences are the ultimate measure of right and wrong, would of course have been using a moral theory, whether they were aware of this or not, they would of course have been using a moral theory that has some kind of family resemblance to the utilitarian system that was first set out by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. In Bentham's system, human beings should act and human communities should organise their affairs in whatever ways will bring about the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And by happiness, Bentham meant pleasure and the absence of pain. Now, one of the things that made this system seem attractive to Bentham and to some of his contemporaries was its simplicity. In principle, you could turn any moral judgment into a calculation. And Bentham, in the book where he articulates this system, even proposes a method for adding up quantities of pleasure and pain. But to his critics, both then and since, this very simplicity has seemed to be one of his system's major faults. he offers a grossly oversimplified account of the human good. And in response to that criticism, of course, many people since Bentham have tried to modify and elaborate and develop his theory, so that nowadays there's any number of utilitarian and other consequentialist moral theories around, on the shelf as it were. But the family resemblance that unites them all is this central claim that the consequences of our actions are the ultimate measure of right and wrong. If you want a slogan that captures the essence of a consequentialist approach to moral reasoning, try "the end justifies the means." Now, some of those who argued against permitting research on interspecies embryos in the recent debates chose the same kind of ground as those who supported it. They argued about the likely consequences of permitting such research. So, for example, some opponents called into question the claim that it will bring great benefits. Some of them also argued that there are risks of various harmful consequences, especially if interspecies embryos were to be used therapeutically. Now, to argue their case convincingly on these kinds of grounds, of course, they'd have to show that the balance of good against harmful consequences that would result from permitting interspecies embryo research was going to be very different from what its supporters were claiming. So different, in fact, that better consequences overall would result from prohibiting it than from permitting it. So some people argued on the same kind of ground. Others, though, in effect challenged the consequentialist terms of the supporters' arguments. They claimed that there are absolute moral principles or rules which mean that we simply shouldn't create interspecies embryos. For example, some people made claims about the moral status of human embryos. The human embryo, they said, is a genetically distinct human individual, and as such, it should be shown the same kind of moral regard as any other human individual. If we recognise absolute moral principles that prohibit us from doing certain things to children or adults, like subjecting them to lethal experiments for the benefit of others, then we shouldn't do those things to human embryos either. Other people argued that crossing the species barrier by creating a part human, part animal entity is a step that we never ought to take. And the reason we shouldn't, they said, is that whenever we do, we blur our understanding of what it is to be human. And that undermines the special moral regards to which humans are entitled. It undermines the distinctive dignity that humans have. Now, people who deployed arguments like these in the debate were, of course, arguing in what are known as deontological ways. That is to say, they were working with some kind of moral theory which says there are moral duties that we ought to honour, whatever the consequences. If a consequentialist slogan is "the end justifies the means," a deontologist's slogan might be "let justice be done though the heavens fall. Do the right thing no matter what the consequences." However, those who offer deontological arguments against research on interspecies embryos face some serious challenges. In general terms, the difficulty they face in public debates is that it turns out to be remarkably hard to show in a way that will convince everyone who's listening that there are such things as absolute duties. If there are, what they are, and why they're binding on us. Moral philosophers have been trying to pull this trick off for the best part of 3 centuries, and the argument shows no signs of ending anytime soon. Some of the people in this debate who offered deontological arguments about the status of the embryo or about human dignity were Christians who appealed to the doctrine of the imago Dei. The Christian claim that humans are made in the image of God. As such, they're endowed with a dignity and a value that are completely non-negotiable. But of course, an explicitly theological argument like that seems all too easy for others to dismiss. The conviction that all humans are made in the image of God, they might say, is a matter of faith. For some people, to be sure, it's a deeply held conviction that must be respected, whatever that means. But because it's part of a faith that is not held by the majority in pluralist modern Britain, it can't be given a decisive role in shaping public policy. Some of those who claim that we have absolute duties in respect of human embryos try to avoid being dismissed in this way. They try to avoid it by basing their claims on more secular-sounding arguments. They might appeal, for example, to the notion of universal human rights. They might appeal to Immanuel Kant's well-known formula, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. But arguments of this sort in debates about the treatment of human embryos don't fare too much better than the explicitly theological ones. Even if the theoretical basis for claiming that there are universal human rights, for example, can be established to everybody's satisfaction, and in itself that's no mean task, that still leaves unsettled the question of whether human embryos are the bearers of such rights. To use a standard bit of philosophical shorthand, do human embryos count as persons, where the word person in this context denotes an individual to whom I owe the kind of moral regard that I owe human children and adults? Now, the claim that embryos are persons in this sense, and as such they're entitled to the same moral respect as you or I, that claim again tends to get written off, rightly or wrongly, as the religiously motivated belief of a minority. A belief they're quite entitled to hold, to be sure, but which they can't expect to be enshrined in public policy. In short, we seem to have something approaching stalemate. There's a standoff between those who argue, largely on consequentialist grounds, for permissive legislation, and those who argue, largely on deontological grounds, that such research should be prohibited. And this standoff seems particularly intractable for a very particular reason. The various sides not only draw different conclusions about the practical issue, whether we should or shouldn't permit this research, they base those conclusions on different philosophical and ethical premises. There doesn't seem to be enough common ground between them to enable those on different sides of the argument to resolve their disagreements. So, for example, the Parliamentary Select Committee on the Human Tissue and Embryos Bill took a great deal of evidence about the ethics of interspecies embryos. They looked at the issue with great care. And at the end of all that careful work, they said that they were unable to reach a consensus on this point. They could only recommend that it be put to a free vote in Parliament. It's not quite stalemate, however. The two sides of this standoff in public debate don't seem to me to be quite equally balanced. What I mean is this. In a culture like modern Britain, the value attached to biomedical research is so high, and the suffering that it's supposed to prevent is regarded with such horror, that consequentialist arguments in favour of things like interspecies embryo research carry a great deal of weight in the popular consciousness. And that means that the burden of proof tends to be placed very firmly and heavily on anyone who wants to object to this kind of research. If I can paraphrase the rhetoric of a great deal of public debate on issues like this, I hope not too unfairly, it goes something like this. If you're going to look all those thousands of Parkinson's disease sufferers and their families in the eye and tell them you want to ban the research that offers them the hope of a cure, you'd better have a pretty darn good reason for saying it. And of course, in a situation where it seems well nigh impossible to find universally convincing grounds for deontological principles about these issues, the prospect of meeting that burden of proof doesn't look too good. So my suspicion is that in a culture like this one, public debate about bioethical questions like these is always going to tend to drift towards a consequentialist kind of rationality. So, thus far I've attempted to sketch out some of the characteristics of one public debate about bioethical questions in contexts like contemporary Britain. And I've claimed that these features are quite characteristic of debates in this area. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that as a Christian theologian, I find the state of affairs I've described thoroughly unsatisfactory. In the last part of my lecture, I want to suggest how a Christian tradition might respond to it. But before I do that, we need to dig down a little below the surface of debates like this one, to try and figure out why these debates have the unsatisfactory character that they do. It seems to me that if we look at a public ethical debate, like the one that I've just sketched, we can discern three related things going on under the surface. These three things often go unnoticed, but they have a great influence on the terms of the debate. They help to give it the character that it has. The first of these unnoticed influences is what the theologian Gerald McKenny has called the Baconian project, after the early modern philosopher and politician Francis Bacon. Now, according to McKenny, one of Francis Bacon's motivations was the practical concern, which he seems to have learned at least in part from Puritan Christianity, to serve God in everyday life by loving your neighbour. And he argued that the natural sciences had a crucial role to play in making this practical service of God possible. The reason they did was that they made it possible to achieve control over nature for human benefit. Now, in Bacon's time, all this happens within a Protestant Christian cultural context. That context supplies a fairly rich notion of what might be meant by human benefit. It also places limits on the kinds of thing that it's permissible to do, even in order to achieve that benefit. But in subsequent centuries, says McKenny, Bacon's vision becomes progressively secularised and narrowed down under the influence of 18th century utilitarianism, among other things, until we get to the present day. And the end result in our time, according to McKenny, is that Western cultures place huge value on the use of science and technology to achieve control over nature. And remember that nature includes our own bodies, with two overriding aims: to relieve suffering and to maximise individual autonomous choice. Now, nobody, certainly not McKenny, wants to deny the good things that have come of this. But if our use of science and technology is informed and directed by this kind of vision, it does invite certain important problems. One of these problems has to do with our understanding of the human good. McKenny thinks that what Western societies understand by human benefit is profoundly influenced by notions that we've inherited from 18th and 19th century thinkers. People like Jeremy Bentham, who, as I said a few minutes ago, defines benefit essentially as pleasure and the absence of pain. And if that's our frame of reference, you can see how it comes to seem obvious that the relief of suffering becomes an overriding good. It has to be pursued at almost any cost, by any means necessary. It becomes increasingly difficult then to acknowledge that there could be other human goods, goods that might possibly sometimes be in conflict with the relief of suffering, goods that might sometimes be even more important. To put the point rather crudely, in Bacon's time and before, it would have been considered deeply wrong to try and relieve your neighbour's bodily suffering by some means that might endanger either your soul or hers. But if that point were made in Western cultures today, the notion that you might be able to endanger your soul by relieving your neighbour's suffering would not so much be regarded as wrong as incomprehensible. In debates about bioethics, we just assume that the relief of suffering trumps almost any other consideration. And I think this helps to explain the very heavy burden of proof that gets put on those who raise principled objections to practices like embryo research in public debates. It also, I think, helps to explain the sort of overheated rhetoric that I paraphrased a few moments ago. Now, I think Christian ethics is obliged to have a problem with the Baconian project, as McKenny characterises it. And I think this for two reasons, at least. First of all, the Christian tradition is committed to a broader and richer understanding of what it means to be human. And that means that Christians can never be content to reduce the human good to the relief of suffering and the expansion of autonomous choice. And secondly, Christians cannot regard the material world in the way that, according to McKenny, the Baconian project tends to. That project, he says, regards the material world as something that's morally indifferent in and of itself, and is there to be manipulated in any way necessary to achieve the maximum benefit for humanity. Now, by contrast, the Christian tradition understands the material world as God's good creation, brought into being for God's good purposes. And as such, the material creation, including, of course, human bodies, as I've said, the material creation has its own value, it has its own proper ends and goals. And for these two reasons, I think, Christian ethics has to say that, of course, the relief of suffering is a hugely important goal to pursue. But it's not always the most important, and it's not to be pursued at all costs or by any and every means. To paraphrase a hard saying of Jesus in the Gospels, it might be possible to gain a whole world of happiness, as Bentham defined it, but, as it were, to lose our souls in the process. The second thing that I think we can discern in the debate about interspecies embryos is a sharp division between public and private life, and mapped onto that division, an equally sharp one between reason and faith. And these two related divisions, dichotomies, are characteristic of societies like contemporary Britain. For a set of complex historical and cultural reasons, there's a widespread assumption in societies like this one that faith commitments are matters of private, non-rational choice. And faith in this context can be understood pretty broadly. Members of society are free to hold such beliefs. They're free to practice them in the privacy of their homes and their churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, gurdwaras, and so on. But in the public realm of policy and legislation, society cannot allow its decisions to be made on the basis of such private, supposedly non-rational beliefs. Rather, it must strive to make its decisions on a rational basis. And in cultures like this one, our instinctive assumptions about what counts as rational are conditioned very powerfully by natural scientific rationality. The more closely a procedure for settling some question resembles a natural scientific inquiry, the more confident we tend to be about acknowledging that it really is a rational process of deliberation. Now, if you do have this kind of split between a private realm of non-rational preference and belief on the one hand, and the realm of public rationality on the other, which of those realms does moral deliberation belong to? It looks as though it rather uncomfortably straddles both. After all, as the interspecies embryo debate shows, society does have to make policy decisions about questions that are obviously moral questions. But many of our reasons for holding the moral convictions that we hold seem to be deeply rooted in the kinds of beliefs and convictions which society assumes are private, impossible to reason about in public. And so I think one of two things tends to happen when society has to make policy about moral questions. Either we try to avoid making any decision about the substantive issues that are in dispute. Instead, we try and devise some kind of procedural settlement that leaves everybody free to act according to their own supposedly private moral convictions. We set up conscience clauses and all the rest of it. Or we look for some kind of argument that conforms most closely to what we're accustomed to recognising as rational. In other words, we reach for the kinds of moral reasoning that look most like the natural sciences. And that means we reach instinctively for consequentialist arguments, since they promise, rightly or wrongly, to settle moral questions by means of calculations about testable empirical claims. And I think this is one reason why the default setting for public ethical argument in a society like this one tends to be some form of consequentialism. From the ethicist point of view, however, at any rate from the Christian ethicist point of view, one problem with defaulting to consequentialism is that it risks ignoring the greater part of the relevant data. It's not self-evident that the only relevant data for moral deliberation are the likely consequences of our actions and the value we attach to those consequences. So unless we can show in a convincing way that these are the only factors we need to consider, we risk apparently solving the problem of moral deliberation by, in fact, misrepresenting it. And a related, deeper problem is that this default to consequentialism rests on what I think is a dubious assumption about what counts as rational. The default to consequentialism tries to make public moral debate as rational as possible by making it as scientific as possible, in a fairly narrowly defined sense of scientific. But we ought at least to consider the possibility that this is inappropriate, that moral rationality operates by different procedures and criteria from natural scientific rationality. At least as rational, at least as rigorous, but different. And that brings me to the third of the interesting and important things that I think is going on under the surface of these debates. Back in the early 1980s, the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre observed that modern moral debates are very often interminable. And by this he didn't just mean that they go on and on and on, though they very often do. Rather, he meant that they cannot be brought to a conclusion, because those on the different sides of the argument don't have enough common ground to enable them to agree how to settle their differences. And if the account I gave earlier was at all accurate, the current British debate about interspecies embryos is a case in point. And MacIntyre developed a famous and influential analysis to suggest why this should be so. Grossly simplifying a long, complex and subtle book, it goes something like this. In modern debates, as we've seen, different positions on practical questions are underpinned by rival, incompatible moral theories, accounts of how to decide what is right or good, like the various consequentialist and deontological theories I mentioned earlier. But MacIntyre argues that these rival moral theories, though they seem totally opposed to one another, in fact have much more in common than separates them. They're all expressions of what he calls the Enlightenment project in ethics. And what he means by that, roughly speaking, is the attempt to devise a moral theory from self-evident first principles by a process of logical reasoning without appealing either to external authorities like the Bible or to traditions like the Christian tradition. And the problem with that, says MacIntyre, is that it's a fundamentally incoherent project. And the reason why it's fundamentally incoherent is that we've actually learned our moral language, our concepts and our insights from somewhere quite other than these modern theories. We've learned our moral language and concepts and insights from an older, broader and richer tradition of thought and practice. Now, what modern moral theories are attempting to do is to give an account of ethics in isolation from any such tradition. So what modern thinkers are trying to do, in effect, is to give accounts of moral concepts in isolation from the very framework of thought and practice that makes sense of those concepts. To use a rough analogy, it's almost as if a clinical geneticist today were to try and explain why some people suffer from cystic fibrosis while deliberately ignoring the last half-century's research in molecular biology. It's that incoherent, says MacIntyre. The Enlightenment project has failed, and it was bound to fail. And that's why we so often find it impossible to resolve public ethical disagreements by rational argument. And faced with this situation, he says, we have two options. We can either admit defeat and abandon the project of moral reasoning entirely, and he associates that option with insights that come from the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, or we can try to recover the tradition of reasoning that makes sense of our moral language and understanding. Now that tradition, according to MacIntyre, is the tradition of the virtues. That tradition can be traced back to ancient Greece, to Aristotle and his predecessors. It grew and developed through the Middle Ages in Western Christianity, as well as Islam and Judaism. But in the modern age, it's become more and more obscured. And MacIntyre says, the thing we have to do if we're to make any sense of our moral reasoning and concepts is to try and recover and reappropriate this tradition in our own time. Now, it's impossible to give an adequate account of that old, rich tradition of the virtues in a few bullet points, but I'll try and sketch out a few key features of the kind of virtue ethic that MacIntyre advocates. The most basic moral question in ethics, according to this kind of way of thinking, is not, as modern people tend to assume it is, what ought we to do? Rather, the most basic moral question, prior to the questions about acts and decisions, is a question like, what kind of people should we be? This kind of ethic is concerned, I've suggested, with virtues. In other words, character traits or dispositions aspects of the kind of person I am. As I become the right kind of person, courageous, just, and so forth, so I will become better able to do the right thing in particular situations. And I'll also develop the kind of wisdom that will enable me to judge what is the right thing to do in any particular situation. Well, how do you learn to be virtuous? It's not the sort of thing you can learn from a book. You learn the virtues by practicing them, by following good examples, by developing good habits. It's a bit more like learning to ride a bicycle than it is like learning to do algebra. Or perhaps a better analogy, it's like serving an apprenticeship to a craft. And that means that you need to belong to a moral community, a community in which you can serve this kind of apprenticeship in virtue. You need a community that contains the kind of people whose examples are worth following. You need a community that can train you in the ways of living and acting that will develop and reinforce the virtues in you. But in order to play that kind of role, a community needs to have a shared, coherent, reasonably stable moral identity. In other words, it needs a tradition. It needs a shared understanding of the kind of community it is, where it's come from, what are its central goods and goals, and so on. Now, by tradition, MacIntyre doesn't mean a static or conservative thing. Any tradition, any kind of moral self-understanding that a moral community has in this sense, is going to have to be constantly negotiated and renegotiated. MacIntyre describes a healthy living tradition as an historically extended, socially embodied argument, and an argument precisely in part about the goods which constitute that tradition. It's a very dynamic, living, indeed argumentative thing. But the kind of argument that constitutes a decent tradition is an argument that's sustainable just because everybody who takes part in it has something in common which gives them the sense of identity that they can then go on to argue about. And that's a very different kind of argument from the sort of fragmented argument that we find in modern public ethical debates, where the participants often seem to be talking, or indeed shouting, past one another, precisely because they don't have enough in common even to have a proper argument. Notice, by the way, that this isn't a claim just about ethics. It's a claim about human reason in general. According to MacIntyre, all reasoning takes place in the context of some tradition or other. Reasoning just works within the conceptual framework that's supplied by some ongoing argument and debate. And of course, while it works within it, it's also pushing back the boundaries of that framework by its new investigations and arguments. And MacIntyre says this is as true of modern physics as of medieval logic, even if modern cultures find it very easy not to notice that fact. Those who belong to a tradition, and I'm coming back now to talking particularly about moral traditions and moral communities, those who belong to a tradition can have a coherent argument together because their tradition gives them something in common to argue about. And according to MacIntyre and others, that something in common has at its heart a shared story. In a very important sense, humans are narrative beings, storied beings, if you like. That's true at an individual level. My sense of my own identity, the kind of person that Neil Messer is, can only adequately be expressed in terms of the kind of story that I tell to others and myself, about myself. And it's true of communities as well. The tradition that members of a moral community share, the tradition that gives that community its identity, that enables it to function as a moral community, that tradition must have at its heart some story or other. The story that the community tells and retells about itself, where it's come from, what kind of community it is, what it exists for. That story shapes the community's self-understanding, and it guides its response to the particular questions and challenges that the community has to face. And of course, in response to new situations, new questions, new challenges, the story itself is going to have to be retold, reinterpreted, renegotiated, its meaning and significance argued about all over again. let me summarise the story so far. MacIntyre and others have argued that the kind of intellectual and moral project that's represented by consequentialist or deontological theories of ethics is a false trail. It's bound to lead to the kind of incoherence that we see in public ethical debates. To do any kind of coherent moral reasoning, we need to recover a very different way of going about the business of ethics, the tradition of the virtues. In this tradition, the most important kind of question to ask is what sort of people we ought to be and become. And the answer to that kind of question can only be learned through practice within a community that gets its moral identity from a tradition built around a story or stories. Now, this might all sound rather abstract and difficult to get hold of. So in the final part of my lecture, I want to try and make it more concrete by talking about my own tradition. MacIntyre's talk of moral communities and their traditions has been taken up by many Christian ethicists who see the Christian church as just that kind of moral community. The church has a shared story. That story is told in its scriptures. It's told in its preaching and teaching and reflection on those scriptures. Churches retell and reenact that story week by week in their worship together. And that's the story that shapes these communities' moral identity at the deepest level. If you're a member of that community, it's not just a story that happened somewhere else long ago. The story draws you into it as well. It becomes your story. And within that community and that tradition, learning to live a good life means learning what kinds of ways of living and acting fit the story. What kinds of life and action don't fit in that story. But of course, the story and its meaning also have to be constantly rethought and renegotiated in response to new situations and new challenges. So when the Christian community is faced with a new possibility like the creation of interspecies embryos, the kind of question it needs to be asking itself is something like this. Can this practice plausibly be incorporated into the story that this community tells about itself? The story that centres on Jesus of Nazareth, whom Christians confess as Messiah and Son of God. Can a practice like the creation of interspecies embryos plausibly be incorporated into this kind of story? Let me be more specific. The story that the Christian tradition tells about the world, humanity and God goes roughly like this. The whole universe, including human beings, is God's good creation. God has pronounced the whole creation very good. But things have gone badly wrong. The creation has gone seriously astray from God's good and loving purposes. We find all kinds of evil in the world, including the kind of evil that Christians call human sin. And by sin, they mean first and foremost refusing to respond appropriately to the God who loves us and calls us to himself. And from this refusal of right relationship with God, all kinds of other distortion flow. Distortion in our relationships with ourselves, with one another, with other creatures. Now, God has addressed this problem by entering our world in the person of Jesus Christ, whom Christians believe was both fully human and fully divine. Jesus lived a human life in first century Palestine, preaching, teaching and healing, until he was arrested and executed by the occupying powers in his country. But on the third day after his death, he was raised to new life. And his death and resurrection have decisively broken the power of evil over the world and human life. And Christians hold to a future hope that what has been begun with Jesus' resurrection is going to be fulfilled in a future age in which there will be no more pain or suffering or evil or death. Now, this is the story that has to give Christian communities their moral bearings. Christian ethics is at its most basic about the kind of life that is a faithful response to this story. The kind of life that's directed, with God's help, towards the ultimate goal that the story promises. So when it's faced with a new possibility like interspecies embryo research, the Christian community has to ask itself, can this practice form part of the kind of life that is a faithful response to that story? And I think we need to distinguish three possible answers to that question. This could be the kind of practice that is blatantly opposed to the Christian story. The kind of practice that instead serves the ends of chaos and destruction. It could, on the other hand, be in line with the Christian story. It could be the kind of practice that can be part of a life that's directed towards God's good future. Or thirdly, it could be the kind of practice that tries to be a substitute for God's good and loving work in the world. It could be an attempt to solve the problems that are caused by the sin and evil of the world without reference to the help that God offers. And in Christian perspective, that kind of attempt, however well-intentioned, would be a basic and tragic mistake. It would be part of what Christians mean when they talk about the sin of pride. But distinguishing between the second and third of those possibilities, the kind of practice that can be in line with God's work in the world, against the ultimately self-defeating kind that tries to be a substitute for God's work, making that distinction could turn out to be very tricky. It's sometimes far from obvious which is which. Now, in my book Selfish Genes and Christian Ethics, I proposed a set of what I call diagnostic questions that could help Christian communities with this kind of tricky moral discernment. The first of those questions goes like this. Is the technological project that we have in mind good news to the poor, the powerless, those who are oppressed or marginalised in any way? We need to ask who stands to gain from it and at whose expense. We need to ask what effect it will have on those who are already on the margins of our societies and communities and on the margins of our global community. Will it tend to exclude them still further, or will it tend to draw them into the heart of things? Secondly, with a certain amount of caution in the words I'm using, is the project that we have in mind a way of acting that reflects the image of God, or is it an attempt to play God? Now, that language of playing God, of course, needs to be used with a great deal of caution, because some people who use it in profoundly unhelpful, sloganeering ways to shut down discussions and to stop any sort of deliberation. I don't mean to use it in anything like that way. What I mean by drawing this particular contrast, if you like, between imaging God and playing God, is something quite specific. What I mean by the language of the image of God is a reminder that humans are finite and limited. We are creatures, not gods. But nonetheless, we've been set in the created world with a mandate from God to live and act in it, to care for it, to take responsibility for its well-being before God. By contrast, what I mean in quite a specific sense by playing God is the kind of way that we find ourselves acting if we forget or deny our creaturely limits. When we assume that we can and may do just anything that we choose. So that's the second question that we need to ask ourselves. The third question is, what attitude does the project we have in mind manifest towards the material world? And again, a reminder that the material world, of course, includes our own bodies. And here I think Christians need to recognise two opposite errors to avoid. One is a kind of hatred of the physical, which could lead us either to try and escape from the physical, from the material, in some kind of false asceticism, or alternatively to subject the material violently to our will. And that's the kind of error that I attributed earlier to the Baconian project. The other error is to reduce everything to the physical, so that we deny or forget that there's more to human life than physical existence in this material world. And this attitude would lead us to assume that to solve any human problem whatever, we have nowhere else to look but our own skill and cleverness, particularly our scientific and technological cleverness. A healthier attitude to the material world will recognise that it's good, that it's worth taking trouble over, yet it's also flawed and in need of transformation. And a healthy attitude won't make the mistake of thinking that physical life in the here and now represents all that humans have to hope for. The final diagnostic question that I propose is this one. What attitude does the project that we have in mind manifest towards past human failures? Many of the human problems which we try and address with our technological projects are caused, at least in part, sometimes in very complex ways, by human error and weakness and sometimes wickedness. In other words, many of the problems that we try and address technologically are caused by aspects of human sin. If we try to solve our problems without recognising our shared responsibility for having caused them, then we risk not solving them, but compounding them. And so a healthy attitude to technological projects that are meant to meet human needs is going to have to include an honesty about our past failures. It's going to have to recognise that things will have to be different in the future. And it's going to have to be open to whatever help we need in making things different, from wherever that help comes. And Christians call that kind of attitude repentance. I've suggested then 4 diagnostic questions which might help Christian communities work out whether a new possibility, like the creation of interspecies embryos, could plausibly be part of a life lived in response to the Christian story. Now, obviously, posing the questions is only the start of the argument. But I think these are the kinds of questions that will help Christian communities start the argument in the way that they should. But to end, I need to return to the questions that I posed in the title of the lecture. In relation to public debates about the ethics of science and technology, in secular and pluralist societies like this one, can this kind of Christian moral reasoning help? And indeed, should it? Well, I believe that it can and should, but in quite particular ways. Christians shouldn't try to help by simply accepting the terms on which public debates are customarily set up. If my argument earlier in the lecture is right, then that sort of help will just turn out to be an encouragement for those debates to carry on in ways which I argue are basically wrong-headed and ultimately will lead us nowhere, or only into a morass. Let me suggest, in the briefest possible terms, 3 ways in which I think Christian ethics can and should help. First of all, I think it can and should challenge the assumption that there is some kind of tradition-free public moral reason that's distinct from the so-called sectarian ethics of particular communities and traditions. If McIntyre is right, all reasoning is traditioned. Moral arguments that are supposedly tradition-free will turn out to be, in some more or less obscure way, the product of some tradition or other, more likely a confused mixture of traditions. And if that's true, then the clarity and coherence of public debate will best be served if the participants are as clear and honest as they can be about the traditions that have shaped their reasoning. And also, if they combine that clarity and honesty with a genuine and serious readiness to learn the moral language of other people's traditions and listen also to them. Secondly, even in a situation in which public moral debates by and large don't function very much like that, Members of particular traditions, such as Christian traditions, have plenty of options for engagement. First of all, they can perform valuable, even if rather negative-seeming tasks. For example, they can point out when the arguments that are deployed in public debates are incoherent, when they have unacceptable implications, when arguments that purport to be tradition neutral are in fact partisan, and so on. But they can also perform more constructive tasks. By articulating their own tradition and its implications as clearly and honestly as possible, they might well find that the things they have to say resonate in all kinds of ways with members of other traditions, and indeed that they resonate with those who don't identify themselves with any particular tradition. So there may well be all kinds of common ground to be explored, there may be alliances to be built, and so on. But thirdly and finally, I've claimed that Christian ethics is learnt and located, first and foremost, in the life and practice of the Christian Church. And if that's true, this isn't by any means a new insight in this mode of doing Christian ethics, but it bears repeating. It's worth repeating, I think. If that is true, then perhaps the most important thing that Christian communities can do in relation to public ethical debates is to live faithfully as Christian communities. What ultimately makes sense of the Christian story is not, first and foremost, learned discourse about it, though in my line of work I have to believe that that is some help. What makes fullest and truest sense of the Christian story is a community of people who not only tell that story, but live their lives by it, and even, if need be, stake their lives on it. A Christian community that has ethical claims to make about healthcare and biomedical research will be able to make those claims with power and integrity, just insofar as its members live their life together as though the Christian story and the things it has to say about such things as health, wholeness, and hope were true. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. This goes off to an excellent start. So it's over to you, everyone. Any questions? John has one to kick off.
Well, first I want to say, Neil, that was brilliant. Took us all the way through, just wonderful. And I was also quite relieved, because I reached the conclusion some years ago that the only reason way for Christians to work their ethics was by a virtue-based system. When I've shared that with people from outside the faith communities, they've often been quite critical, that your virtues and character traits that you believe are virtues are not necessarily the same as what another group would hold to. And that's, I think, been something that's concerned me about how to work a Christian ethic in our 21st century society, based on virtue.
Yeah. Yes, I think there are two complementary ways of answering that. And one is a way that's been developed quite fully by MacIntyre working as a moral philosopher in books after Virtue, which was the book in which he first developed this line of argument. And the other is a way that's been developed by those Christian theologians who've taken their cue from him and taken his thinking in theological directions. One way is to say, well, the point about a tradition of reasoning is that it is reasonable, and MacIntyre has always denied very strongly that he's any kind of moral relativist. He said it is possible for traditions to encounter one another and to settle between them the question of which is the truest or the fullest. And you can set up an engagement between different traditions with their different visions of good, and various kinds of things can happen. One might simply turn out to be superior to the other. One might sort of incorporate the other, or you might get some kind of new synthesis that incorporates aspects of both. But you have to be very careful about the terms in which you set up that encounter, because the one thing MacIntyre says you can't do is adopt some kind of Archimedean point that's free of all traditions from which to judge the merits of each one. That just don't work, because whenever humans think, they are already thinking within some tradition or some confused mix of traditions. So that's the philosopher's answer to the question. It is possible to bring different traditions into encounter with one another, and for them to have a go at thrashing out their different visions of the good. The theologian's answer, well, the answer of some theologians who've picked up MacIntyre and run with him, often tends to be along the lines that the practice of a moral community is, well, more important than its learned discourse. And so the ultimate test of the truth of a community's tradition and its moral vision is going to be the life of that community. And that, in a sense, if, for example, a Christian community has a tradition which gives it a particular vision of the good that it claims is true, then that claim is going to seem credible insofar as the community lives by it. And if people out with, say, a Christian community find its tradition and its vision of the good unconvincing, then, well, there could be a lot of reasons for that, but in part at least it could be a reproach about the level of faithfulness with which the community lives by its own tradition. So there's two possible answers, but to argue in terms of the virtues doesn't condemn you to a sort of irreducible relativism.
Well, I'm glad of that. But we'll still have that situation where some virtues are more regarded here and others are more regarded there.
Oh yeah, but I think in fact, when you're talking about public debates, the kind of MacIntyre, the MacIntyre philosopher's answer needs to be taken very seriously. You need to find ways of setting up the encounter between different traditions in ways that will enable them to sort out their different visions of the good, and for, you know, either to get some kind of new synthesis of different traditions, or for one to show itself to be more fully true than the other. The problem, and the first problem in public debates in modern societies, of course, is getting all the sides to admit that they do belong to traditions.
Yeah.
You know, I mean that's a bit of the analysis that MacIntyre and others have tried to develop. But as far as some people are concerned, they've lived in vain. You know.
But I guess the aim of the Enlightenment was universal values, and what you're saying is that that project is flawed. And we do have individual communities, but at the same time we're not going to end up with relativism or postmodernism or something, which it does kind of sound slightly like.
Well, no, it's really a question about what kind of universalism you're pursuing, because the MacIntyrean critique of the Enlightenment project is that the kind of universalism that it's chasing is a phantasm. It's a fantasy that can't be realised, because it's pursuing a kind of universalism that is independent of all context and all tradition. You know, to go back to that word. Now, the tradition that MacIntyre wants to recover and reappropriate, of course, is a tradition that in the Middle Ages did make very bold claims about a kind of universalism. I mean, it's the kind of tradition that is dominant in the medieval West, and expounded most fully by Thomas Aquinas. I mean, MacIntyre becomes much more explicitly Thomist in later books than he is in Art of Virtue, and he often he talks about an Aristotelian Thomist tradition, or sometimes just about Thomism, and that's the kind of tradition that he thinks is the best we've come up with so far. Now, that's a tradition that certainly claims a kind of universalism, but it goes about it in a very different way from the kind of universalism that Enlightenment thought seeks. And someone like MacIntyre would say it's a much more promising way to go about it, because it's truer to the way that human reason and practice work.
Well, that's immensely helpful, thank you. Simon?
One of my confusions with virtue ethics is that as soon as you try to justify any of the virtues, it collapses back to consequentialism or deontological. So for instance, take the three virtues you list on your slide there: courage, justice and truthfulness. If I wanted to justify why courage is a virtue, if I was, say, a religious believer, I might say, oh, I've got theological reasons, traditional reasons, etc. But a consequentialist might say, yes, but a society in which courage is a virtue is a more successful human society. How do you avoid virtue ethics collapsing back into consequentialist or deontological?
Yeah, I think anyone who tries to justify a virtue ethic and to justify the virtues in those terms has probably missed the point. I mean, certainly if like MacIntyre are right. The reason it's easy to miss the point in that kind of way, in contexts like modern Western societies, is because we've forgotten one of the crucial points about an ancient and medieval virtue ethic, which is, to use another bit of philosopher's jargon, that it's teleological. Now you can introduce a bit of confusion there, because consequentialist theory is sometimes also called teleological, but the way I'm using the term is very different. What's meant by that is the notion that human life is directed towards particular ends or goals or purposes. We are made for particular ends, and that there are particular ends or goals or purposes that are proper for human life. And a good human life is a life that's directed towards those ends. Insofar as we become diverted from those ends, we're living a kind of disordered life. Now, that's a notion that progressively disappears in modernity. We lose any sort of shared conception of the ends or goals of human life. In modern societies, we tend to assume that each individual determines their own ends and goals and pursues those willy-nilly, and what society has to do is just to set up a kind of level playing field that allows everyone to pursue their own ends or goals, whatever ends or goals they happen to have chosen. This older tradition of the virtues says that there are certain kinds of goal that it is good for humans to pursue, simply because that is what human life is for. And a human life that pursues those goals successfully will flourish and will be a fulfilled human life. A human life that turns away from those goals will always be an underdeveloped human life, and sometimes might become a deeply corrupted human life. Now, the reason that a medieval thinker like Thomas Aquinas can say that, I'm paddling out into quite deep theological and philosophical waters here, but put very simply, it seems to me that the reason a medieval thinker like Thomas Aquinas can say that is because he has a Christian doctrine of creation. Because he knows that the world, including human beings, is the good creation of a good and loving God. And the world and human life have been created by God for God's good purposes. And therefore, a good human life, a fulfilled human life, is going to be in accordance with those ends. And so, the justification of the virtues, so this is a rather roundabout answer to your question, but the point is the justification of the virtues isn't just in terms of consequences, the way we narrowly tend to understand them in modern discourse. The point about the virtues is that they are those dispositions, those leanings, if you like, and those character traits that will point us in the right direction towards the proper goals that be pursuing. There's a phrase, again going back to McIntyre, there's a phrase he uses somewhere, that the virtues are the qualities that help to bridge the gap between human life as it actually is and human life as it would be if it fulfilled its telos, if it fulfilled its proper end or goal. And you have to make, I think you have to have some sort of teleological concept of human life. You have to have some notion that there is such a thing as the human good in order for a notion of the virtues to make sense and not simply to collapse into some kind of consequentialist reasoning. Now, I think there are ways of showing that it's quite reasonable to claim that there are certain things that are good for human life to pursue, and there are other things that are not good for human life to pursue. But it's a deeply unfashionable kind of claim to make in modern secular and in the technical sense, liberal societies. Does that help to clarify?
I still struggle a bit, because if the point of a virtue then is to achieve what the good end of the human life is, then that's consequentialist, because you're doing the virtue in order to get it.
Well, it depends. I mean, in a sense, yes. There's a family resemblance between the way modern moral philosophers use the term teleological and the way a virtue theorist would use it. But what's meant by consequences in a modern consequentialist theory is very, very different from what's meant within let's say, a kind of Thomist framework of the virtues. Because modern consequentialism, in the final analysis, finds it very difficult, if not impossible, to say how we should decide which consequences are good and which aren't. I mean, so I said at some point in the lecture, I used a phrase that the consequentialist assumes that the only data of ethics are the consequences of our actions and the values we attach to those consequences. Now, what tends to happen in consequentialist theories of ethics is that the second of those collapses into a more or less arbitrary thing. Basically, we end up having to say, as a kind of counsel of despair, that we just attach whatever values we happen to attach to particular consequences. And I mean, if you follow a sort of quasi-Benthamite kind of utilitarianism, then you say that whatever consequences will make the majority happiest, whatever consequences, just as a matter of arbitrary fact, will give the majority of those who are affected the greatest possible pleasure. Those are the consequences we should pursue. Now, something like a Thomist virtue ethic is very, very different from that, because it says that regardless of the preferences we happen to form, there are certain things which are actually good for human lives to pursue. Because there are some things that independently of our own preferences, if you like, independently of our own perceptions, there are ways of being human that more closely conform to what we are meant to be. And there are ways of attempting to be human that miss the mark. And that's the crucial difference, I think, between a pre-modern and a modern approach to ethics in that sense.
Thank you. So let's move on. Yeah, gentlemen.
Dr. Hutchinson, I recall 3 years ago going to my first National Bioethics conference, and the chairman was giving instructions to those that would be chairing sessions, and one of the things he said was, to all intents and purposes, if anybody takes the floor with a question that puts a virtues ethics argument, shut them down before they get on their hobby horse and railroad the meeting. Now, the question that I have is the argument that you put of using in Christian ethics a virtues-based ethics argument. Are we in danger of actually having that same being isolated from the debate for that in that same in the same condition that I saw him, because society, a secular modern society, doesn't want to hear about virtues ethics and finds that sort of almost alien, and therefore that it's an argument that you can't sell. You understand that, and all that does is put us in the same dilemma.
Well, it's quite possible that could happen. I mean, different contexts vary a lot in this. I mean, there are some contexts that are so aggressively modernist and secular in the kinds of ways we've been talking about that they really won't want to hear any of that stuff. Other contexts, even in modern Western public forums, are more hospitable to it. In a sense, I tend to say something that could be glib, but I hope it isn't. I don't think it need be, which is that the business of those who belong to a particular tradition, such as a Christian tradition, is to witness faithfully to their tradition and its moral implications. Yes, they have to find the ways of witnessing that will communicate most effectively to whatever context they're in. Right through Christian history, people have done that. So you don't deliberately choose incomprehensible language to speak to the particular context you're speaking in. But the business of, let's say, a Christian community is to give voice to its distinctive convictions and the frame of reference that makes those convictions reasonable. And in a sense, what happens when it's done that is not up to it. It must simply bear patiently whatever happens to it. Now, sometimes that might mean being largely excluded from public forum. I think that happens less often than we tend to assume. And I think it is a bit tempting for some Christians some kinds of Christian communities to get a kind of martyr complex about this and assume that the rest of the world always wants to shut us up and push us out, and sometimes to go about their witness in ways that almost invite that. Certainly, no Christian community or tradition should do that. But if you belong to a particular tradition, when you've articulated what that tradition has to say as clearly and faithfully and persuasively as you can, well, you've offered the best gift you can to those that you're engaging with. Now, very often you may find that the gift is surprisingly welcomed by others, because there are all kinds of points of contact. There are things that resonate. And I mean, if members of a Christian community, a Christian tradition, claim that they have important things to say about the human good, and if they're in any sense right to claim that, then it shouldn't be surprising that some of those things resonate with at least some of the others who are listening. So there may well be sometimes surprisingly positive results when Christian communities do that. But I tend to think they're much better advised to do that, even if it means being sidelined or misunderstood, than to try and play the game according to a different set of rules. Because the rules aren't neutral, the playing field isn't level. If you set up the debate in consequentialist terms, it's going to, it's going to bias it in one direction rather than another, and that is not a direction that's going to be very consonant with Christian convictions or insights.
Gareth, I think you had a question about that.
I just wonder in practice just how distinctive the Christian community is. And all through your talk, I mean, the reason I was asking is, and I'm afraid I was putting on a medical hat, But I thought, well, let us say you have someone who's been diagnosed with carcinoma of the colon. I would have thought that most Christians act in a highly consequentialist way. I mean, they even pray in a consequentialist way for healing, recovery, etc. Now, I just wonder how we should approach that sort of situation, which after all is very uninteresting in a way, but really what we do is very much part of our high technology enterprise. But how, thinking of the virtue ethics, your diagnostic questions, how then should one approach that sort of situation with that sort of diagnosis? I mean, that's the one. The other thing is, of course, there are huge differences of opinion within the Christian community. So let's say you've got within a fairly local Christian community 2 couples with fertility problems. One has gone down the road of IVF, now got a couple of children, they're delighted with them, most people don't even know they're IVF children, etc., etc. But another couple who decide, for a whole host of reasons, that they will not go down that path. Now, do you think that in that instance, one of those couples is more in accord with the sort of virtue ethics sort of approach that you would like to see, and the other is not? Or is that not the right sort of question or approach?
Let me take the second of those first. I mean, what you've given is an example of the kind of ongoing argument within the community that is in an important sense what someone like MacIntyre means by a tradition. I mean, that's part of the ongoing argument within a particular tradition is going to have to be about new situations and new possibilities, and whether these new possibilities do or don't fit the story that gives the tradition its identity, and what counts as appropriate action in terms of this tradition in response to these new situations. And that's that's an argument that very often isn't easily or quickly settled. So your 2 couples, well, it could be that the question of whether they should have fertility treatment or not is, as it were, a matter of indifference. So the tradition doesn't supply a hard and fast answer one way or the other. It could be that the tradition doesn't supply a kind of blanket answer, so that it could be. This is going to sound very woolly, very sort of woolly liberal, and it's not. I mean, it could turn out to be the case that there isn't a blanket answer to the question: is it right to practice IVF or not? So both couples turn out to be right because both couples have made the right decision in terms of the project, which is their particular Christian lives. Or it could turn out to be that one of those couples is actually wrong and the other is right. That either this practice is or it isn't, in general terms, consistent with the Christian story. But it may not be possible to figure out which is right yet. It might just take more argument and more discernment than we've yet had time or opportunity to do. So, there is a possibility in principle that one of them is right and the other is wrong, but maybe in good faith, as it were. But this is all part of the ongoing vigorous argument that we should expect to find within any tradition, including a Christian faith tradition. Now, to go back to your first question, you suggested that a lot of the time Christians, like others, argue in respond in highly consequentialist ways. I'm not sure. Maybe they do. If they do, they shouldn't, I would say. But I'm not sure the scenario you've described is an example of Christians acting in consequentialist ways. Because, of course, this tradition can perfectly well say, of course, healing is an important goal to be pursued. Of course, the relief of suffering and pain and the curing of life-threatening illness is an important good to be pursued. I mean, nobody, not McKenny or anyone else, is denying that. And to put it in virtue terms, of course, the virtue of compassion, as part of, to use medieval terms, part of the theological virtue of charity, love, in what Christians often call agape. Of course, that is an important virtue to be lived out. And for centuries, one of the ways in which Christian communities have lived that out is by the practice of medicine. So of course, what a surgeon does using all the learning, the scientific insight and the technological skill and cleverness at his or her disposal to treat somebody's carcinoma of the colon. Of course, that can be an exercise of Christian virtue. And the grain of truth that modern societies have held on to when they recognise that the relief of suffering by using scientific and medical techniques is an important goal to pursue. I mean, they've retained that grain of truth, I would say, from this older core Christian notion of compassion. Not just Christian, but it's certainly a core part of the Christian tradition. Where the Christian tradition ought to differ from habitual modern attitudes is that modern societies find it easy to assume that's the only kind of goal we ought to be pursuing, or the overriding goal that trumps all the others. And Christian traditions have to put their hands up and say, well, hang on, this is one important thing, but it belongs in a broader and richer framework of other things. The virtue of compassion is an important virtue, but it's only one component of the virtue of charity. If you go back to a thinker like Thomas Aquinas, there's a whole lot more to Christian love, theological love, as it were, than just compassion, though compassion is part of it. So does that help to answer?
Oh yeah, it's very helpful. I won't push you at all onto the interspecies from that, but no, that's fine.
There's a question at the back, and I think we're going to have to draw to a close fairly soon for this evening, but yes.
Yeah, I want to question your appeal to the tradition, and especially when you talk of the Christian tradition, because you present it as if it's a single framework, yet Christians themselves are very divided about the technological projects. And once we appeal to the traditions, I'm not sure how helpful that will be to the in forming the public policy debate, because if the Christians themselves cannot agree on a single issue, or they can't agree about a single project, how in the world are they going to come together in order to inform the public debate issue? And the second thing I want to ask is about the Baconian project you talked about, because I'm not sure whether, you talked about expanding it in order not just to be the relief of sufferings, but if we think also of the Christian ministry, if we think of the Christ ministry itself, it's a ministry of healing, feeding the poor, all those kind of things. It's a world of trying to better ourselves, and I think that's the Baconian project. I don't see any incompatibility between the Christian ministry and the Baconian project.
Thank you. To go back to the first of your questions, and part of the reason that Christians can't agree among themselves, and Christian communities and traditions can't agree on many of these questions, part of the reason, but only part of the reason, is because Christians in modern Western societies anyway, suffer from the same problems as other members of those societies a lot of the time. Christians have picked up the same habits of mind and practice as other members of those societies. And so some of the disagreement that you find within Christian communities is because they're still too much influenced by what McIntyre calls the Enlightenment project. That's some of the reason, but of course it's always having to renew itself and face new situations. So we should expect there's going to be ongoing disagreement within any tradition. And of course there are lots of different strands of the Christian tradition, and they disagree sometimes among themselves. Argument within the tradition. And it's also going to have to be conducting a kind of argument extramurally, as it were, with other traditions and sort of mixtures of traditions. And you're just going to have to find ways sort out all the answers for themselves and then present them to the public. They just have to be, I think they have to be honest about their own ongoing arguments and disagreements, but nonetheless, they can still be prepared can say in public, and should say in public, well, as far as I understand it, as far as I can see, this is the implication of the faith that I hold for these questions. And I offer this to public debate.
Now, I'm realising it's 9:30, so we've had a full hour and a half and more, I think. And there should be some drinks next door. So I think we'll thank Dr. Messer for giving us a tremendous start to the whole week.